you so much for that warm welcome. I'm so happy to be here, and I'd like to also welcome you to Johannesburg, because I lived in New York for many years. I lived in New York for 7 years. So it's a pleasure for me to welcome you here, and you don't have to have your coats and your scarves. And the weather is fine in Johannesburg. We've had a deluge of rain most of the summer. So this is the best that Johannesburg has to offer. So I hope it treats you well. So one of the traditions that my professor, who is my mentor, Andre Duchoy, taught me was, before you talk, you must tell people your intellectual biography. So before I tell you about this biography, I'm going to tell you about my own intellectual biography, where I come from intellectually. So I see someone, for example, with a t-shirt that says Black Seminarian. So I'm also a seminarian. The only difference is, in South Africa, the seminary that existed was for women. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about that history. So my grandparents come from a mission school tradition. So what that means is that back in the 19th century, my great-grandfathers converted to Christianity. And by converting to Christianity, one of the decisions that they made was to educate their daughters. And luckily for us, the American Congregationalists created an institution called Inanda Seminary, which was created in the 1870s. The first educational institution for black women, in South Africa. And if any of you want to know, I'll talk a little bit about this. But most of these institutions in South Africa, mission schools, were non-racial. So anybody could go, but obviously the white population often used to choose not to go. So one of the interesting things about these seminaries and mission schools was that the missionaries' children often used to attend school with the black kids, while the white kids had governesses and tutors. And in fact, black people in South Africa were at the forefront of the creation of educational institutions. So people like John Doe, they created Oshame, long before there were many private schools in South Africa, or even state schools for the white population. So what I'm going to be telling you today is exactly that kind of story, like my own story, of someone who was the first convert in their family, and who converted to Christianity, and then the repercussions. But before I get there, so that is my family, my larger family tree. Oh, thank you. So it means I can control text. My larger family tree. So I grew up in Soweto, and just went to an ordinary primary school like everybody else. And my grandmother was a dressmaker, self-taught designer, and so my grandmother used to make clothes at home. And so that's also the tradition that I sort of identify with, because my grandmother was a very strong influence on all our lives. My mom, my grandmother made sure that all her daughters were educated, went to university. So my mom went to university, her sisters went to university, and there was no option out. So let me give you a funny story that my mom told me recently, which is that my grandfather's eldest daughter came to visit Soweto, and then within a couple of weeks of visiting from the rural areas, she had a boyfriend. And she went steady with someone. And then the family came to open negotiations for bride wealth, right? She was only 17 at the time. So my grandfather apparently sat there and nodded and very smiled politely, and they were giving tea and all of that. And as soon as they left, my grandfather packed her bags, said, "You're going back to the rural areas." She was on the evening train back to the rural areas. My mother was like, "No child of mine is getting married at 17. You're going back to the rural areas. You must be a teacher. You must have a qualification first before you can get married." So my mom told me this story the other day. And I thought, well, that sounds exactly like my grandfather. And so my mom often says, "Your grandfather was a liar," precisely because he never used to tolerate. So he protected all his daughters and made sure that his daughters didn't get married until they had qualification. And at that time, the easiest qualification was obviously being a teacher or being a nurse. So most of my mom and her siblings were teachers. Now, one of the effect of that, and this is where my intellectual biography begins, is that I grew up in a home where there were books all over the place. So as a child, I actually demanded that the adults read to me. So every time I would pick up a book, I would give it to an adult and say, what does it say? And so eventually, when I was about 4.5, my grandmother was just like, teach the child to read. So I was taught to read at home. And from the age of about 4.5, I used to just take every book that was in the house and just read it and read it and read it. So as a consequence, school for me was sort of like, okay, my grandmother used to say, you're going to be with other children. I don't really have that much of a memory of school. I remember sitting at home reading encyclopedias. I remember reading books like Invisible Man when I was a child. I was probably about 12, 13. My mom was also a librarian, and she used to take me to the teachers' colleges where she used to teach. So my mom used to teach library science, and she just used to let me loose in the library. So I would read, Alice Walker, Zora Neale Hurston. So as a child, and I had no idea of this other world called America. I had no idea about where it was, but I used to just read and read and read. So now when I look back, I realize that in some ways, my grandmother's decision that I should be taught to read at home was the beginning of my intellectual biography. In that I never felt that there wasn't a book that I couldn't pick up and read. So nobody could patronize me. I think this is what my grandmother used to say to us. So one of the other things my grandmother used to say, she'd say, what is beauty going to do for you? Beauty will do nothing for you. Concentrate on what's going on up there. So my granny also used to make sure that you didn't grow up obsessed with your image in the mirror. So you must be obsessed with the image that is inside your head. So I would say that my grandmother was one of those very stern. She used to do it from behind the sewing machine. All of this lecturing, she used to do it from behind the sewing machine. So she would be there working as a seamstress, cutting patterns, doing that, and then she would listen to our conversations and correct us and tell us, no, you cannot talk like that in the house, and give us lectures. So that is the first, I think, installment of my intellectual biography. And then I went to Inanda Seminary. And again, at that time, Inanda Seminary had been around since the 1870s. And it was falling apart, it was an old school. It didn't seem to have the charms of going to posh private schools that everyone was doing at the time. And it was only later that I discovered the entire history of Inanda Seminary. So for those of you who are interested, you can look it up. As I said, it's the oldest institution for women in South Africa. It's older than most of the schools for white women in South Africa. It was started in the 1870s. And after Inanda Seminary, I then got a scholarship. I went to the UK. I did my A-levels in the UK. Then came back to South Africa, and then went to the University of Cape Town. At first, I thought I had only two options. I wanted to either be a journalist or to be a civil servant. And I applied to the university called Rhodes University, where I was going to study journalism. Rhodes University used to have one of the best journalism programs in South Africa, so I thought that's where I'm going to go. And then the second option was to go to UCT to study to be a civil servant. When I did my first module in public administration, I thought, hell no. No way! I'm actually going to spend the rest of my life doing this. It was so boring. I thought, oh my God. So I then changed majors and did politics, philosophy, and economics. And even then, I was kind of plodding along. And as I said, it was important for me to tell you about my own reading. I've always been an independent reader. So I was still reading books. I was still devouring books. Like my family. So just the other day, someone told me, one of my cousins said, when you were young, you were actually so irritating. And I said, what? They said, you used to stand at a kitchen sink, washing dishes, with a book in one hand, and then washing the dishes with the other. And so if it was my chore to dry the dishes, it would take forever, because he was standing there with a book. I used to do that. My cousin was like, yeah. And we would be standing there, come on, go and play, come on. So I continued being that person, so even at university. And then in my third year of university, I Andre du Toit. Now, Andre du Toit was one of the first people in South Africa to create a course called South African Political Thought and Traditions. Essentially a course that covered the entire history of thought in South Africa. I mean, you can already imagine the biases that are involved in, because obviously we're talking largely about written text. So it will be a course in the entire history of written text, beginning in the 17th century. So you would start with the arrival of the Dutch and the arrival of enslaved people in South Africa. And we can talk about it because South Africa has got its own very interesting, more Indian Ocean story of enslavement rather than the transatlantic slave trade. So it's a very interesting, so we would study all of that. And then right at the end of the course, we would also begin to study the history of Black thought. And so Andre du Toit would start, and this was very interesting at the time, would start with the emergence of the independent churches in South Africa. So the conflict that emerged, the missionaries used to essentially tell their Black congregants that they were not ready to minister, that they were not ready to become bishops and elected officials within the church. And then they would break away and start their own church. And so he would start with that tradition and say this is one of the biggest traditions in the history of South Africa, precisely because it has had so many successive iterations. So he would combine that with then the history of political thought, petitions that people wrote in the 19th century, petitioning against segregationist laws, petitioning against exactly the kinds of rules that made my great-grandfathers decide to educate their daughters. So for example, many Africans used to be forced to live under what the colonial government thought as customary law. So for example, your daughters would not be educated unless their husband approved. Your daughters would not be allowed to register for a bank account unless their husband approved. So I mean, it would be like this continual succession of a kind of sorry. I don't need a mic. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. I don't need a mic. I don't need a mic.
It's okay.
Okay, sorry. Where is the presentation? Oh, sorry. If you were asleep, you are awake. I don't know whether it's saying you're running on reserve power. Do you need a, yeah. Okay, so we'll get to it's totally blue. Oh, and Andre du Toit used to also combine teaching about this history of independent churches. And so this is, imagine this is supposed to be a politics class. So you're supposed to be learning about something about politics. And he would make essentially religion part of the history of politics in South Africa and say you cannot understand the history of ideas in South Africa without understanding the contestation of a religion and how it is that churches used to essentially risk losing their African congregants simply because they did not want Africans to discuss politics. And so I became interested in this particular issue because my own family, as I explained, comes from that mission school. And then he would end with teaching Black consciousness. And I'm going to mention the racial dimensions here. So imagine a sort of elderly white professor standing in front of a classroom of mostly Black students saying, I'm about to tell you about Steve Biko, and then teach about Steve Biko, teach about Black consciousness. And so Andre du Toit was the first professor that I took courses with that I thought, this is what I want to do. And this is also one of the reasons why I wanted to study the history of South African political thought, was because Andre would say, you cannot talk to someone unless you ask them what their intellectual biography is. He was the first professor to not assume that they know who you are simply because you've walked into their classroom. He was the first professor to tell me who you are and where you come from, what political ideas have shaped you. So he opened the space for many of us to talk about these intellectual traditions that are not mainstream. So it's not like simply saying I'm a Christian or I grew up in a Christian home doesn't really make any sense unless you say, well, you know, my great-grandparents actually are mission station residents, they owned land, they were farmers, they did all these things that don't have anything really to do with religion on the surface of it. But actually, when you dig deep into the family history, you realize that religion had everything to do with it. The way that even the way that people posed for photographs had everything to do with their sense that you need to know where you come from. So, I mean, the history of South Africa, we have these unbelievable photographs from the 19th century where these patriarchs would see that their sun is about to set, and they would say, my family must come, all the kids would come from all over South Africa, and they would pose for just one picture. Like 20 children, 20 grandchildren, they pose for just that one picture. Because the patriarch is like, it's time for me to leave you, but you need to know where you're going. And so all those kinds of issues, everything that my grandmother used to say to us suddenly made sense when I started reading about these independent churches. And just to give you a sense of how much my grandmother knew, my grandmother would say, yeah, I even remember Marcus Garvey. She said, yeah, they used to say the Americans are coming. So my grandmother even remembered Marcus Garvey. And she would tell us about Marcus Garvey and oh, well, okay. So then to suddenly read Marcus Garvey when you are at university, you suddenly think, oh, this is what my grandmother was talking about when she was saying the Americans are coming, Marcus Garvey. So Garveyism was one of those huge intellectual traditions in South Africa. Even today, there are still people who are Garveyists. You know, Marcus Garvey is still on the way. Marcus Garvey is still coming. And so that entire history was taught to me in one single course, in one single semester at university. And from that point on, Andre du Toit became my mentor, and he also introduced me to Magma Fuze. I'm not sure whether or not we can get the power connected, because I think it's refusing to show the slides unless I... Huh? If you don't mind just asking. So I'm going to show you just a snippet of a picture. So this is the person I'm going to talk to you about. His name is Magma Fuze. He was born about the 1840s. I think it's refusing to do the larger picture because it's running on reserve power.
Does anyone have a larger than over there?
A power pen, huh?
It's a very old chunk. It's not a USB.
Oh, okay. Ooh, okay, let's try and see how much I can do. So the most interesting thing about this man was that he was born in the 1840s, and this is an estimate because he showed up at the mission school. And I mean, for those of you who are interested, I mean, missionaries have very interesting ways of measuring children's age, like how many teeth has the person lost, etc. So this is an estimate that he was born in the 1840s. And he was born in what was then already a colony, the colony of Natal. Now the most interesting thing about this man is this is the only photograph we have of him, which is why I was telling you the story about photographs. This is the only photograph we have of him. And he made sure that when he published his one and only book, that this photograph was inside the book. So he published his own image inside the book.
Can you spell the name? I'm sorry, I can't see that far and I don't...
Oh, okay. This is M-A-G-E-M-A, that's his first name, and his second name, Fuze, F-U-Z-E.
Thank you.
Perfect. So at any point, please stop me. If I say something that you don't understand or you'd like me to clarify, please stop me. So he was born in the 1840s, and essentially, I'm just going to turn my machine around. I find this very, I think you can see. Oops. I think you can see, right?
No, we can see that.
Yeah, we can see it.
You can see that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's fine. I was like, oh, man. And I also, because I spent so much time on my presentation. So this is actually supposed to be black. That's why it's also disconcerting. So you're supposed to be able to see the... Okay, so he shows up then at a mission station. Now, I must tell you a little bit about the context. The Anglican Church wanted to send a bishop to South Africa because the white population had grown so big that they wanted to build a church for the white population in the colony of Natal. But they also wanted to send a missionary. So they thought, let's do both. Let's send someone who is a missionary bishop. This has only been done once in the history of South Africa. And I will tell you in a moment why it's only happened once. So they sent someone who was both a bishop and a missionary. So he was supposed to basically minister to the white population, hold church services for the white population, do the rest, baptize children, etc., etc., and then convert the African population to Christianity. And soon enough, those two roles started to conflict with each other. So this has already died. Let's hope that we can bring it back to life.
Prof, can we call him a missionary?
A missionary. I like that. Yeah, and you can also, based on the story that I'm about to tell you, you can start making phone calls to the Anglican Church, because I'm about to tell you a story about John William Kalenzo. So John William Kalenzo came, he taught himself to speak isiZulu, which is the indigenous language spoken in Natal. He taught himself to speak isiZulu while on the boat to South Africa. So by the time he landed in South Africa, he could say in an indigenous language, where is the road to Pietermaritzburg, which is now today Pietermaritzburg. It used to be called, it's called Gumundo even now. And he built a home, and then he built a school. And he imagined that all the African chiefs and the African leaders would bring their children to the school. But then that was the first hitch. It was like none of these patriarchs, and I will use the term patriarch, were willing to part with their eldest children. And instead what they did was like, they would say, oh, would you like my youngest son? Or would you like my daughter? I'll send that person along. Now this was a kind of survival or protective strategy by many African kings and African chiefs, because they're like, I don't want my oldest son, the person who's going to inherit my status as a chief, to become white or be anglicized. But I'm okay if my youngest go that way. So it was almost like, and this is how Magma Fuze describes his own transition from being a little boy to being sent to a mission school. Is that it was as if they were throwing him away, and that's how his mother interpreted it. Like, you're taking my child and giving my child to the white people. And so Magma Fuze thought of himself as having been given to the white people. But for him, it was a positive thing rather than a negative thing. Because he says as a child, he used to prophesy that he was not going to grow up at home. And so his family would be like, okay, what do you mean you're not going to grow up at home? Like some great man is going to come and I'm going to go work for him. So it was like he had grown up with a prophecy that this was going to be his life. Now that prophecy came true, but for totally the bizarre reason. And this is the story. Kalenzo started to question this role of being a bishop and a missionary at the same time. Precisely because the white population would then start sort of making war on the black population and making intimations that the Zulu kingdom should be destroyed, etc., etc. And Kalenzo was like, that's not what I'm here to do. I'm not here to approve every single incursion that is made by the colonial government against Africans. So as his proficiency in indigenous languages increased, he began to ask people directly, okay, so what happened? So every time there was a war, or someone was arrested, or someone was shot, someone was killed, Kalenzo would then do his own investigations and go and ask and say, what happened? And then the Africans would tell him a totally different story to what the colonial government had told him. Kalenzo would be like, okay, I think I believe the Africans. And so before the 1870s had even wrapped up, Kalenzo, quote unquote, had gone native. I'm sure you all know that term. He had gone native, and the white population started essentially not liking Kalenzo. Like, okay, no, you are obviously on the wrong side. And so there began to be this schism where his role as a bishop and his role as a missionary started to conflict. And Kalenzo essentially decided that he was going to use his role as a bishop to defend his position as a missionary. So as I say, just to give you a sense, he is the only person who ever signed himself as J.W. Natal. So he used to put the name of the colony as his signature because he was he had been given the right by the Queen to essentially be the religious authority of the colony. And soon enough, this led to Colenso's excommunication. So all these conflicts over Colenso taking the sides of the Africans in every single conflict eventually led to his excommunication. And this is the part where I said you can get involved now. He is still excommunicated. So you may want to read the story. Because essentially the Anglican Church, and I mean I was listening while I was finishing this book, I was listening on the radio one day, and an Anglican bishop, actually without even skipping a beat, said when he was asked, why is Colenso still excommunicated? This was only like 10 years ago. He said, it's because we don't know what it would mean to rehabilitate him. And I said, wow. So this is still a live issue in the Anglican Church. That this bishop and missionary who came to South Africa and sort of changed the meaning of Anglicanism for especially Africans is still excommunicated by the Anglican Church. And in South Africa, what that sort of in episcopal terms meant was the church in South Africa actually divided. So you ended up with the Anglican Church in South Africa and then sort of the high church that Colenso represented. So Colenso died in about the 1880s. And what ended up happening was that the Magma Fuze had been trained as a printer. So while living on the mission station, Colenso brought a printing press. Magma Fuze was trained as a printer. And many of the converts around Colenso worked in his printing shop. So this is where you can see the relationship between what in the book I call the work of hands and then the intellectual output. It's because Magma Fuze actually learned how to print books. And so for him, it was totally natural to imagine himself as a writer. But this is full of comedy all along the way because all these Africans who are educated at mission stations are beginning to take over the presses that the missionaries had got. Because the missionaries wanted to produce text in indigenous languages. So in South Africa, the history of the media goes all the way back to mission stations. There were no white newspapers. White South Africans were not really interested in newspapers. It was black people who were like, we want to know what's going on in the world. We want to know that Booker T. Washington has died. So one of the most interesting things about being in the archives was seeing the hundreds of articles that were published in black newspapers when Booker T. Washington died. And it was literally like, and they were all serialized. So you'd be like, Booker T. Washington has died. And then there would be like a whole column explaining who Booker T. Washington was. And then the next newspaper would have, and literally dozens and dozens of articles, all decrying the death or eulogizing Booker T. Washington. And exactly the same thing happened with the invasion of Ethiopia. So, I mean, I was sitting in the archives working on this man, and I would see all these articles. Ethiopia has been invaded. And you see every single newspaper over weeks sort of writing about the invasion of Ethiopia. So again, here you can see the history of Ethiopianism, what people like to call Ethiopianism, and then this history of sort of the churches and these Africans who have been trained as printers, as artisans. I mean, in South Africa, just the adverts that used to be put in the newspaper calling for black artisans. So someone would say, I'm looking for I'll use the term that they use, a native saddle maker. Then you think, you mean that there were no white saddle makers in South Africa? There were like black ones? And it's exactly that. It's because on the mission stations, those are the skills that missionaries taught in order to make Christianity in some ways a livable religion for Africans. Because this was also the conflict, was the idea that if you're an African, you should be working for a white man. So the idea on mission stations was you should be working for yourself. Okay, yes, you are propagating Christianity, you are propagating the gospel, but you should also have a living. You should earn a living. Sorry, is someone trying to get me a charger?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Is it gonna work? Okay. I'm gonna relax about that. We'll catch up with the visuals. We'll catch up with the visuals once we get this thing going. So then, Magma Fuze trains as a printer, works with Colenso. Colenso prints dictionaries in indigenous languages. He prints all these political tracts where he is debating issues. And as I say, he's excommunicated for essentially writing, everyone in the world. So if you just Google John W. Colenso, there are thousands of articles that were written at the time. And every single one of them was mostly about how it was that this missionary, how dare this missionary go to Africa, and instead of converting the Africans, he gets converted. So Colenso's daughters all grew up speaking indigenous languages. They were all fluent. And as I say, he is literally the person who created the largest record of actually what happened in that colonial period, sort of between 1840s and about 1890s. Like his record of all the events that happened in colonial Natal is more accurate than even the history books, because as I say, he would interview Africans. And obviously, there's a lot of self-interest involved here. He wanted to learn indigenous languages. So he would interview Africans and keep a record of what they said. And literally every court case that would happen, he would be there, or one of his daughters would be there recording what is going on in the court case. So he became a kind of, and I've written about this if you want to read it, a kind of amicus curiae in the language of the law. So he would make sure that he is a friend of the court. He would say to the court, I have contrary evidence to what the colonial government is presenting, and this is the evidence, etc., etc. So Magma Fuze then became part of that until Colenso died in the 1880s. And then this world started to fall apart. And this is when even my own grandparents' story starts to also fall apart. Because once the end of the 19th century takes place, and you have this kind of the British government essentially giving up on South Africa. Right, back then there was no gold, no diamonds. So South Africa was pretty much a kind of backwater up until the 1870s when gold and diamonds were discovered. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, great, we have a colony in South Africa. Before that, the British government could have given up on South Africa and totally ignored the country. And so Colenso almost dies at exactly that time, when South Africa moves from being a kind of colonial backwater into the largest producer of gold in the world. So the other day I was talking to my uncle about this. I don't know how many of you know, but 2/3 of all the gold reserves in the world came from South Africa. So I was like, hello, I was saying to my uncle, literally all of it, like 2/3. The white population just gave it away to everyone. Oh, let's have a gold party. You want some gold? Have some gold. So literally 2/3 of all the gold reserves in the world came from South Africa. And so that was the moment in the 1880s when that extraction from South Africa happened. And essentially what then happens is all black people are told, well, now you can go work on the mines, you don't have to work for a white man, but you still have to work. And all the colonial legislation in South Africa is then sort of tweaked to discourage, and this is one of the sort of histories of South Africa, which I love talking about, is nobody ever said we're discouraging black people from not working. That's not the way they used to say we're discouraging idleness. We don't know, and the only people who would be idle were obviously the black population. The legislation was never meant for white people. White people could be idle, but not black people. And so you end up with this very interesting history then of the attempt to push black people off mission stations. So colonial governments used to find all sorts of excuses, like your cattle are stolen. Like they would just, some white person would come and say, those are my cows, you stole them. And I'm going to go to the colonial magistrate and tell them that you stole my cattle. And before you know it, an entire mission station is destroyed because a white man claimed that his cattle had been stolen and they were on the mission station. And boom, the black people have lost their land, they've lost their base, essentially. And also they've lost their religious home. Because many of these mission stations were religious homes. Many of them were multicultural. So as I said, white people were more than free to live there, and some white people would choose to go and live amongst black people on mission stations, get married to black families. So my own family, like again, these are things that my grandmother never used to talk about under apartheid, and then all of a sudden, when apartheid ended, my grandmother used to say, "Do you remember the woman we used to call Matring?" And I'd be like, "Yeah." She said, "Yeah, that's because her father was Trim, and she married my brother." And so, like, my grandmother's brother was married to a mixed race woman, and this all used to happen on mission stations, right under the nose of the colonial government, exactly because the missionary would become a kind of chief. So as a kind of ruler of the land, he was allowed to make decisions about how the black people could live on the land. And the colonial governments obviously didn't like this. They didn't like the fact that there were these areas of autonomy and independence that were called mission stations. And as I say, a whole succession of black communities were then evicted essentially to provide labor for the mines. And
how did the missionaries gain so much authority over the lives of the people who were here?
Number one, I hope this is a question that you're so I'm going to answer it this way. Number one, there were so few of them. Like I say, South Africa was a total backwater. There was nothing particularly attractive about coming to South Africa. Because the farming was hard. I mean, South Africa is almost everything that has happened in South Africa is accidental. Like the farming industry, heavily subsidized from the 19th century because farming was hard and the rains are irregular, so you cannot really create like a farming community. And I mean, this is the most amazing part, is exactly that these convicts who were living on mission stations would do things like divert water from the river and dig all the trenches, and the missionaries would be involved in all of that. So there were few of them, so that was one of the reasons. And then because also of the expanse of the land, the white colonial governments used to be just like, okay, go there and convert them to Christianity, see you in 6 years' time.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that I understand how the colonial powers gain power and influence over the people by military means.
Yes.
But how did the missionaries, were they backed by the colonial powers? And, I mean, how did people just get subjugated? Were they on the threat of the gun, or?
When you say subjugated, do you mean how did they end up with mission stations?
Yeah, I mean, it seems as if they just gave up their rights, and if you said the missionary became like the chief.
Yes, it's a complicated history because one of the things that, so let me give you an example of how it is that, so in African culture, we practice, it's almost like the Old Testament. So for example, when your husband dies, your brother can take over you as a wife. It's called leverage, right? It's in the Old Testament. So our ancestors practiced it. So if you're a woman and you didn't want to be the husband, the wife of your former brother-in-law, you often used to flee to a mission station. And so many women would take that as their refuge and flee to mission stations. You had other practices that people would try and flee from. Things like if you, I don't even know how it's said. So African chiefs would loan you cattle, right? And this is how African chiefs used to ensure their own power. They would loan you cattle and say, these are my 10 cattle. I'm loaning them to you. All the calves that are born, so this is the African economics. All the calves that are born are yours. But when I want my cattle, you have to produce them. And then something would go wrong. Like people would be like, oh, I don't want to be under this chief anymore. But if I take the cattle back, then it would be a clear sign that I no longer want to be under the chief and I may get killed. And so people would flee to mission stations to run away from their relationships with chiefs. I mean, even though I love my kings and queens, the relationships were often ones also of reciprocity. And sometimes that reciprocity was hard with people, so they would flee to mission stations. And then also because of what is called primogeniture, the fact that the eldest son inherits everything. Younger sons in African society often didn't have much of an incentive to stay close to their father because they get nothing. The brother gets everything. If the father's wealthy, their eldest brother gets everything. And so many of them would flee to areas or colonized areas because they could earn money working. And so they would become rich by working. So in South Africa, essentially many of us, when we go to our family gatherings, there's the elder brother's family. They're all traditionalists. They do all the things. They brew their traditional beer. They sing to the ancestors. And then there's us, the doctors and the professors, walking behind. Because our grandfather was the eldest, was the youngest son. So in many African families, even now, you have a split between the part of the family that belongs to the eldest son, who then had to keep the flame, as it were, keep the flame going, the flame of tradition. And then the younger ones who were westernized and who went to school and their daughters are there. Like I say, it's very much like, so in my own family, it's like, oh, we need to do a ceremony for the ancestors. A phone call is made to the rural areas and some granny from the rural areas will come all the way to Soweto just to brew the beer for the ancestors, because like the people who live in Soweto have no idea how to perform these rituals. So even now in many of our families, it's still like that. There's still that split. So does that make better sense?
Yes.
It's more about the fact that the hierarchy of the family meant that the younger sons, almost like the only way they could become wealthy was becoming business people, becoming farmers, becoming educated, and then the eldest son would be the king, the chief. So I mean, even just recently in South Africa, there was a huge succession dispute in the Zulu royal family. And I mean, the ignorance that was in the newspaper, because so many people were trying to give their opinions about this. And then people would come to me because I know the literature. They'd say, is this true? I'm like, no. So people were saying things like, the Zulu king can't be king because he's not married. I'm like, well, the founder of the Zulu kingdom was never married. So he can be the king, he doesn't have to be married. People would say things like, he needs to have more than one wife. And I was like, you sound like the colonial government, because that is what colonial governments often used to use that as an excuse to depose African chiefs. They say you're not a proper chief unless you have 5 wives. You have to have 5 wives. And no, you cannot have 1 wife.
Wow.
And then they would just be like, oh, you're not doing this customary thing properly. And they would depose you. And so there was a whole investment that colonial governments often used to make in the functionings of customary, what they perceived as customary law, because it kept control, especially over women. So this is one of the areas of conflict that comes out with men who convert to Christianity, because many of them educated their daughters in the way that they were educated. They sent their daughters to mission schools. And under colonial law, if you were a black woman, you couldn't inherit property from your father. Literally, your uncle, your brothers could go and sue for the property. And every single penny would be taken from you. Because that was customary law. They'd be like, but these are your traditions. So imagine a white magistrate saying to you, these are your traditions. That your brother should get all your property. Sorry, you have to take the property, give it to your brother, because those are your laws. And you'd be like, what? My father! I mean, literally it'd be like a piano. You wouldn't be able to inherit a piano. Your brother, your uncle would come and say, this is my piano now, because you are a girl. You cannot inherit property.
So was there never a time that it had to be times that they resisted the colonial government's decision?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So was there warfare? What extra dog that allows because I can't imagine that they could just say, okay, to people who have known nothing about the tradition.
Yes.
Okay, that's fine. I can't believe that they did.
No. I mean, you're right. So let me try and explain something about the colonization of South Africa and how it is that it wasn't a single event. So it would happen slowly. So it would be like 1652, Jan van Riebeeck arrives. He creates the castle in Cape Town. So if you go to Cape Town, still there, you can see it. He sort of lives in this little barricade. He's barricaded with his Dutch soldiers, and they are trying to barter. I mean, it was not at all like power. It would literally be like they would run out and say, can we have 2 cows and then 2 sheep? And then they would barter and then go back to their barricade. But eventually, you end up having to have someone who's looking after your children, someone who's nursing your children, you teach them Dutch, and before you know it, there's conflict over just that. The fact that so-and-so's daughter is now working as the nurse for your children. And now eventually you have to go beyond the fort, and you have to start bigger relationships, whether they are threatening relationships, symbiotic relationships, but the relationships develop anyway. So this is going to come out. I've written a huge article on the history just of translation in South Africa, and how it is that the need for translators by itself creates a kind of colonial mindset. Because you need to know, you're like, so what is this called in your language? So eventually you have to grab one of the people from the other language, say, okay, let me teach you my language, and then we can just agree what this is called in my language. So, I mean, and in South Africa, the very first translator, so this is what I argue in the article, was actually a woman who worked for Jan van Riebeeck and was kind of adopted by Jan van Riebeeck's wife. She was the maid, she was the confidant, she did everything. And then there's even the possibility that Jan van Riebeeck went beyond just being a father to this young woman. But again, we will never know, because the record that is written of her is from the colonial side. She married I think a Norwegian doctor, and then he died on some colonial excursion to Mauritius. So now this young woman has children. She was one of the people who ended up on Robben Island long before Nelson Mandela ended up on Robben Island. She was one of the people who ended up on Robben Island. She ended up with an alcoholism problem, but I mean, this is from the Dutch perspective, right? They put her on Robben Island with her children. And she had helped the Dutch, she had been their translator. So it sort of becomes a continual, sort of like a little, as I say, it starts off with a white guy walking out going, I just need one sheep. Can I barter one sheep for a bottle of rum? And then the next time it's 10 sheep, and then it's 15 sheep, and then it's, oh no, I want the whole flock. You know, it's kind of, in my language, our grandparents used to say, sometimes you give someone a hand, and then they take the whole arm. And so it's exactly like that kind of idea, is you give someone a hand, and then they take the whole arm. So I mean, that's how colonialism really happened. I mean, Africans could resist. And again, if you're interested in the book that I'm working on now, on African men who actually sort of played it both ways. Because many of them would work for the colonial government, but then when they could see that, oh, this colonialism thing, not so much, they would then try and swap and go back to traditional ways. And they would revolt against it while wearing the military uniforms of the British or the Dutch. They'd be like, okay guys, we think actually we are more powerful than you here. And they would show that force in very peculiar ways, just to do with dress. So for example, they would kill British soldiers and then take their jackets and then walk with and ride on their horses wearing their jackets and then show up for a negotiation. Say, hi, we're here to negotiate. And then like the white side is like, hang on a minute, why are they wearing British coats? It means they killed. Like, but now what do you say? You can't say, but you killed, no, because you didn't see them murder. You just see the guys wearing the jackets. So they would wear like British military coats, British military wear. They would make their own military style uniforms. So yeah, we know we're more powerful than you, so we're coming. But their dreams of autonomy were so, what's the right word? They would be so convoluted. It would be like, we need back our land, we need back our chiefs, we need back. And then there's the very same people that they would have been fighting with would go against them. So you would end up with Africans essentially fighting with each other. And it's exactly over, are you a friend, are you a foe? And it would be just these cross-cutting sort of lines of bad blood, because they all knew who they had murdered, who they had been sent to kill, blah, blah, blah. So in South Africa they said you have a file on someone. They had files on each other. You know, receipts upon receipts on each other. And so it becomes very difficult to create like a united fighting force if you are all sort of not even sure who the enemy is. Yeah. And this is how it is that, and I mean, it involves everything from things like how, I hope this is gonna help, how gunpowder, for example, and guns arrived in Africa before the arrival of the white man. And this is one of the things that many people don't realize. They sort of assume that white people arrived sort of ready to colonize, but actually that's not what happened. So in the case of Southern Africa, the coast of South Africa was basically unnavigable with ships. And so you'd have shipwrecks. And so all these white people would literally wash up on the shore, destitute, with nothing. And the African communities would take them in, feed them, and then the next time like a ship with white people comes along, and what do? Oh, the Africans forced me, they were force feeding me, they made me wear their clothes. And it would literally be like the person would turn against the people who had been feeding them and clothing them, and the white So I mean, in South Africa, this is one of the stories that is not told about, exactly as I say, the idea that in some ways Western modernity arrived even before the arrival of white, because as I say, all their luggage from the shipwrecks would eventually wash up on the shore, and all sorts of things would happen, as I say, and some of them would even marry into African families. So someone wrote, if you want to look it up, it's called The Sunburnt Queen, about this white girl who essentially washed up on the shore, no family, nothing. She was incorporated into a Xhosa society, she married a chief, but then she constantly would be standing on the shore, pointing, so this is part of the story. She knew that she had lost something out there, but they didn't know what it was. But she became a Xhosa. She was incorporated into Xhosa society, and she lived as a Xhosa until, as I say, the next boat comes along and it's like, oh, people who look like me! I'm God! I mean, this is literally like the constant story. And so in South Africa, only now are people excavating some of those histories. Because, as I say, the simple narrative of the colonizer who arrives on the boat and starts shooting Africans is actually that's not how it actually ends up working out. It ends up working out in many more complicated ways. And as I say, when you just have to ask yourself a simple question, like why were people attracted to Christianity, then you find answers that go beyond just the religious and the divine. It has everything to do, as I say, with things like running away from leverage, running away from bad marriages, running away from a chief, running away from the power of the chief. Are we winning? Oh, okay. Okay, so I was going to show you a picture of the book that I wrote on Magma. So now I want to sort of, before we run out of time, how many more minutes?
You can take another 10 minutes.
Okay.
Is that okay to speak?
Oh.
Or should we just do that in the next session?
No. I can give you I'm sure I can give you that mark. Did I throw it in here? There you go. It's just under Anabaptist seminar. Yeah. So then this man who is trained as a printer never becomes part of that story of Africans who end up on the mines, and he continues working as a printer. So by the beginning of the 19th century, he's impoverished. By the beginning of the 20th century, he's impoverished. His well-being, his livelihood, all depended on the mission stations. He's now essentially teaching printing at different schools and also working for now the emerging sort of white newspapers. He's working as a printer. He's teaching printing to younger people, etc. And then this is when I then found him in the archives, because then he started writing for many of those newspapers that were emerging in South Africa in the early 20th century. By this time, he's already an elderly man. But I can tell you, it was such a shock and a pleasure. He had such a sense of humor, so I'm going to talk about it in the second session. Like many of these newspapers, many of you would imagine that these people who are facing sort of white colonialism, who are facing theft of their land, all of that, were all about politics all the time. But it wasn't like that at all. They were fighting with each other over the most bizarre issues like, yeah, I saw you at the party drinking last weekend. You call yourself a Christian, you and that. So you see, okay, so the more things change, the more they say the same.
Topic good.
So you see exactly that. So I imagine your name in the newspaper, someone outing you that you're not a real Christian. Oh, you're not a real Christian because you were at a party. You are now trying to defend yourself. Okay, so how do I move? Oh, thank you so much. I'm so happy.
Dr. Love, I need an NDA statement here.
Okay, so Magma Fuze then was involved in those debates, in those fights, and hundreds of pages. Many of these newspapers were proper tabloid size. What do they call the 16-page? And they used to come out every week.
Magazine?
No, they were like full size. Yeah, like they're in the Wall Street Journal. And so many of them were 16 pages, and they used to come out every 2 weeks, or every week. Oh. Do I need to? Oh, okay, perfect. Okay, so this is the man. So I can now catch up using the visuals. So in the early part of the 20th, he's impoverished, but he keeps writing. And for me, this was the shock because, as I said to you, so this is the picture of him in his old age. Wait.
I'm sure you can use the buttons.
Oh, sorry, the buttons. So this is the. Oh.
You just have to press.
Yeah. So this is the book that I wrote on him. Magma Fuze. Can you now see the writing? Yes. Okay, perfect. And this is the book that I wrote on him. My book came out in 2011. I spent years of my PhD going to the archives. Like every couple of months, I would go to the archives. And again, because nobody knew anything about this man other than that he published this one book, which I'm about to show you now.
Just tap it.
Oh.
Are you on the arrows?
Yes. Oh, sorry. I think I moved the.
Yeah, tap it. Just tap. You don't have to press just tap.
Oh, okay, thank you. I've got it. So he published this book in 1922. So already he was in his 80s. He published a book, and the title of the book was radical for the time. He was the first African to publish a history book. Essentially say, I'm going to tell you where black people came from. Now some of you may not even guess if I tell you where he thought all black people came from. Any guesses? Yeah, he said Egypt actually. He said all black people originate in Egypt. I mean, at that time, it was a radical idea in the early. And just to give you a sense, his book was published in 1922. The tomb of Tutankhamun was opened in exactly the same year. So for those of you who know, Ellen Locke, I think, was sent by African Americans to come and check that they were not gonna dabble with the history. So Ellen Locke, I think, was there when they opened the tomb of Tutankhamun. So the tomb of Tutankhamun was opened in 1922. His book was published in 1922 with that radical claim. And this is what he said. He said, you know, black people have got all these stories about where they came from. They think they came from the reeds, they think they came from this, but let me tell you, we all come from Egypt. That is the source of the Nile, and this is where every single black person in the world came from. Now, one of the reasons why this was a radical point of view is he had lived on the island of St. Helena. He had been sent there to tutor the Zulu king, whom the British had exiled to the island of St. Helena. And Magma Fuze traveled there in the latter part of the 19th century to be a tutor to the king. And on the island of St. Helena, if any of you know, that is where the British used to deposit all the enslaved people that they liberated from the other shipping, the shipping boats. So whenever the British used to, what is the name? There's a naval where they used to cordon off a ship full of enslaved people. And they used to push it, the Navy used to push it to the island of St. Helena, and then disembark the people, and then leave them on the island of St. Helena. Fend for yourself, you're now free. And go. So the island of St. Helena was populated by black people, but of mixed heritage and mixed race. And Magma Fuze went there to tutor the Zulu king, whom the British, as a punishment for rebellion, had exiled there. So he lived there, he had interviewed and talked to people on the island, and had discovered that many of them had names that were recognizable to him. So names that were quote unquote what we would say Bantu names. And he'd be like, oh, your name is Billy Billy. That makes total sense to me. I know what that means. And it's like, oh wow. So it means as black people we are one. So this is what he writes in the book. He says the truth of the matter. He says as black people we are one.
Yes.
And so this was like the radical sort of thesis of the book, that every single black person essentially belongs to a single community. And he writes about this in this book. And as I say, he presents all the different theories. You know, this is what these... And what is interesting is that then the book is translated to English in 1979. And this is one of the reasons I then went to the archives. The person who translated it removes all the references to literature. Like, oh, this man was just making this up. So it makes it look like he was just kind of... yeah. So, oh, this is a quaint and beautiful story, but this man never read any books. So just to give you a sense, even Wikipedia followed this. So my cousin was asking me about, let's say about 5 years ago. He said, why don't you correct Wikipedia? Wikipedia had exactly one sentence on this man. And Wikipedia said Magma Fuze was the illiterate convert of Bishop Colenso. And it was like, for years it was like that. So while I was doing my research on the book, that was the one line that was on Wikipedia about this man, that he was illiterate. So my cousin was like, but why don't you correct them? I said, I don't work for Wikipedia. I'm not going to correct them. I want people to know how it is that Wikipedia deals with African history. Like I say, one line that was dedicated to this man who had spent his entire life writing. And then Wikipedia says he's illiterate. So this is then what happens to the book. This version of the book, so originally, the way that I thought about my research was I was going to take the original Zulu version and then compare it to the English. And then sort of point out all the things that had been cut out. Like they literally just cut out huge chunks of his original book. They rearranged the text, everything. So I was like, okay, this is going to be like a big condemnation of like publishing and da-da-da. And then when I went to the archives and saw all the articles he had written, all the letters, all the fights that were on it, I was like, this is more interesting. Black people by themselves are more interesting than any story. Right. So I was like, that's the story I want to tell. I want to tell the story of this man as a black intellectual and how he was involved in the same intellectual debates as other black intellectuals of the time. And so this is what I did in the archives, literally microfilm after microfilm. And I don't know how many of you have used the microfilm machine. You know that after about 2 or 3 hours, your eyes are so sore. You literally are just like, I need a nap. I need to lie down for days. I don't want to see another. So I spent day after day with the microfiche looking for his articles. And like when you tell young people now, like there's no search command on their microphone. You're searching with your eyes. You're literally looking. Like, is this a black person? Is it? You know, you're literally looking with your eyes, searching with your eyes. There's no search function. So I did that, and I literally excavated this man's entire writing. I mean, he wrote an article almost every month. He published in the newspaper. In his old age, he was going, and at that time, you actually had to send those letters with the post. You had to go to the post office. So there's loads of letters written about the indignity of going to the post office, and how you have to stand a separate line because you're black, but it's all in the newspapers. And these Africans recorded it all, like, you've given us writing. We're going to tell you the crimes that you are committing. And they would fight about these on the newspapers. So his body of work has not yet been put as a separate book to this book that was published. And as I say, I don't have any issues anymore with this book because the debates were much more interesting. So just to give you a sense of what we're talking about, the area. So I was trying to give you the geography. So was the colony of Natal was essentially outnumbered right up until they destroyed the Zulu kingdom in 1879 by the Zulus who were to the north. And you can see the kingdom of the Zulus. I don't have a clicker. So you can see there where I've got the pointer. No. You can't. So this is the Zulu kingdom up here in the north, and this was the colony. And this thick black line here was a river that many converts crossed back and forth to go and interview people on the other side. You know, what is happening in the Zulu kingdom? And then they would come back with news. And Fuze did exactly that. He would cross over to the other side, to the independent Zulu kingdom, and come back. And even that alone is a kind of comedy of manners. So again, horses were very important at the time. So this is another story that some of you may be like, horses, really? Like horses were very important at the time. So even the Zulus wanted horses. So then they would go over to the other side with their horses or whatever. And people would be like, oh, can you give me a ride? I also want to come to the colony. And then they'd be like, no, you cannot come with us. You cannot ride on my horse to come back to the colony. We'll get into trouble. So this thick black line was essentially the line of independence. So the other side was an independent African kingdom, and then on the other side was the colony. So this is just the geography. And this is sort of the sea right here. So you can see where Natal is in relation to the ocean. Oh, sorry, I'm going to get this right. So this is one of the arguments. Sorry, do you mind if I just quickly blow my nose?
No.
So as I said to you, one of the things that I wanted to explode, the myth that I wanted to explode, was that this man had only produced one thing, right? This is a sort of historical record that had been created. So one of the things I used to keep on asking my mentor at the time is, this man has been a footnote for so long. How do I make him the main text? You know, this is the conversation that my mentor and I would have, where I'd be like, everywhere, every history book on the Zulus contains Magma Fuze as a footnote. So how do I make the argument that no, he's not just a footnote. He wrote the text that everyone else then copied and tried to borrow from, etc., etc. And all these white writers used to interview him. They would go to him and say, oh, tell us about the Zulu kingdom, and he would agree. And then, boom, the white person has written a whole fiction about the Zulu kingdom and da-da-da. And then maybe like a sentence acknowledging that they talked to him. So when I went there and excavated all of these things, and what I discovered really was that he was not just, the first African to publish a history book, but that it was not a novelty for him to be an author. And then when you then see his book, and this is one of the arguments that I make, that the book that he actually ended up publishing was a kind of anticlimax. He knew he was dying, and he was like, I need to leave a record behind, that I was a writer, that I was a historian. And so he essentially pulled together all the things that he had written in the newspapers and then put them in a book and had it published. And literally the same year that he published his book, he died. So he sort of knew he was running out of time. And it was his way of sort of leaving that physical record that I was here and I did the work, as it were. And so when I then read all his articles, the book suddenly just receded into the background. Like, okay, the book is there, I can refer to it, but the real meat of the story is the fact that these Africans were so funny, so smart. I mean, if you want to know what people were wearing back then, what they wore to their weddings, like weddings were a big thing. They would be like, and then there were 12 bridesmaids, and they were all wearing white silk crepe with, like, this is all done in indigenous languages. People are describing an entire wedding, what the MC said, what music was sung. in an article. They would describe tennis tournaments, soccer tournaments, and it would all be in these newspapers. And as I say, then the politics of blackness from all over the world, you know, Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey, it would all be in these newspapers. And in the second session, I'm going to actually show you physical copies of what these newspapers look like. And as I say, many of them are still there just in microfiche form. So the first step then in creating this book was about moving away from this idea of this man as a kind of novelty. And then, as I said, this whole story about what was happening in the Zulu kingdom. So this is one of the things that he was witnessing, what was going on to the Africans in the Zulu kingdom. And as I say, they would ride across the river, go and fetch news, and then come and print it in the newspapers of the time. And so this act of witnessing becomes another sort of extension, I would say, of kind of the religious notion of being a witness. And just to give you a sense, I mean, you may not like to hear this, but converts were not welcome in the Zulu kingdom. And again, there's a whole story about why African kings were suspicious of Christian converts. And much of it has to do with this idea that you were essentially worshipping two kings. And so the African kings would be like, it's not possible for you to serve two kings. You must choose which one. You must choose which one. So this is what I call sort of, he writes about this. He publishes a serialized articles called Uqala Kokuhlupheka, The Beginnings of the Troubles, where he's talking about how it is that the white population in Natal was essentially trying to destroy the Zulu kingdom by spreading these exaggerated stories about how converts were being killed in the Zulu kingdom, how the Zulu king was trying to destroy Christians, etc., etc. And so these are the kinds of pretexts that the colonial governments often used to give to destroy these African kingdoms. And so I want to end, maybe I should try the next time to give you pictures to show you, because Cetshwayo, the last Zulu king, and again, this is a very controversial, so don't repeat this outside of the room, because there is a sitting Zulu king. But the last reigning king of an independent kingdom, Cetshwayo, actually had to go to England to plead for his kingdom. He had to be shipped to England, and Magma, Fuze and John William Colenso were involved in all of that, in sort of facilitating the trip to England. And then when he got there, he became a celebrity. Like, I mean, this is a whole story that, again, I do not have time to say. Everybody and their grandmother was wearing a pin with the Zulu king. There were plates that were made to commemorate the visits of the Zulu king, etc., etc. And so he was treated like royalty even while his kingdom was being taken away from him. So when he came back to South Africa, he essentially found that half of his kingdom had been given to his relatives. The question that you were asking, his relatives who were fighting with him. There was a white man, so Jacob Zuma, so I'm going to give you like a quick sort of summary of South Africa. So under traditional customary law, you're allowed to have more than one wife. So people often say Jacob Zuma. Oh, Jacob Zuma has how many wives now? 9, 8? 6. There was a white man living in the 1880s who married 30 African women. He had 30 African wives. John Donne was giving a piece of the Zulu kingdom. So John Donne created his own chiefdom with all his wives and his children. So just if you go to the archives, it's unbelievable. Somebody actually did a genealogical, it's like a son of all the descendants of John Donne and his wives. It's like it radiates, like it's almost like an artwork. Because he had 30 wives, and he was totally allowed to do that because he was a friend of the Zulu king. And he betrayed the Zulu king, and then suddenly he shows up. He's like, oh, I'm now a king like you. I now have my own kingdom. So this is what happened. And Magma Fuze was a witness to all of this, writing about it, publishing about it in the newspapers. So I will give you like a better visual of what these newspapers look like in the second session. I think we should stop. So we're going to have a separate Q&A, right?
Yes.
Okay, so if people have questions, please African newspapers, African writers of the 19th century. That is my area of specialization, if I can say that. And I'm one of the few people in South Africa who has actually bothered to go and reread these newspapers. So whatever question, if you want an article about something, I'll be like, I think I know where you can find it.
Thank you for that session. We'll break for tea and we'll come back soon after the session. 15 minutes. Okay.
Thank you so much for listening. See you in session 2.